Let's go back to you, Matt, and talk a bit about the cost of a data breach. What are the financial and operational costs of a ransomware attack, as an example, and how can cyber liability insurance help mitigate these costs?
Well, I think the first thing you look at is just again, the discrepancy between the old policies that were out there and, a traditional cyber rider that might have existed. For a long time, we saw that in the commercial insurance world. It was a 25,000 or $100,000 rider. And of course, the challenge with that was there was little basis for that value. I think the insurance companies didn't take really a deep enough dive in it. I don't think the valuation that was put on the cost to insure that risk, or dollar for dollar, was really appropriately put in place. I would compare it to some of the first long-term care and nursing home policies that came out. It was $1,000 a year, and we're expecting your nursing home costs will be $100 a day. And it's fast forward, and it's drastically different landscape, of course. So when we're looking at kind of those ransomware attacks, tipping somewhere on average of near $500,000, and certainly exceeding millions of dollars in many cases. It doesn't even, I think, go to touch on the, reputational, exposure. What does that mean for, the lost clients in the future? And I mean, we see that in the identity theft space, for example. If you have to notify all of your clients you've suddenly had a breach and their security has been compromised, it's, what's the trust and likelihood of them remaining a customer, continuing to do business with you? So I think that's why the cyber liability insurance itself, being able to, offset that cost and, recoup and provide against that is valuable. But I think at the same time, all of the proactive measures that can be put in place from a cybersecurity standpoint, not only reduce and eliminate that in dollar cost that I think is now starting to be a little bit more in line with what the actual cost might be. But I think it's also helping, proactively avoid all of those other, kind of ancillary effects of that aren't necessarily just financial. It's, the loss of business, the loss of customers, the loss of future trust, loss of, referrals that you might have garnered. Right. So I think there's just a lot of different elements that go into that. And this is just, kind of one piece of the puzzle as far as, establishing a real comprehensive risk management strategy.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. Kirsten, you and I have talked recently about kind of lines of coverage and requirements, and so I'm curious as to your thoughts on this question, especially with what Matt shared there. What are, to put a finer point on it, what are the differences today that we're seeing in like lines of coverage relative to this question, and how do you think that's impacting the cyber insurance market in general?
Well, the big one is that the amount of coverage is being decreased around ransom attacks, because obviously they're significant, and there's, again, this misalignment between what have you done to protect yourself and the expectation that if you have $1 million policy, we're going to be throwing $1 million worth of recovery towards that remediation effort. The thing that I think is interesting, and because you have it at the top here, data breach, right? And what's happening with ransom attacks is that it's almost becoming de minimis what the ransom is, because everything that comes behind it, to Matt's point, is, the reputational harm, the breach notification. It's like, becoming 10 to 50 times more expensive to remediate and to do investigation and notification than it was actually to deal with paying a ransom, if that's what you have to do. And so part of it goes back to, again, the posture of, and I've had smaller organizations say, we're in a state where we may have privacy laws. It's like, it's kind of onerous that you're expecting us to have the encryption of this data. It's really expensive. So can you change that rule? And it's like, no, I can't change the law. Actually, that's the law. And so it's really helping people understand that not only are these requirements, but they're laws. And if you haven't encrypted the PII data, as an example, not only do we have notification costs and everything that are really expensive, but we also have, like in California, mandatory damages, like for everybody, no matter how big or small you are. And so it becomes just this thing that continues to spread. And And so as we talk about, it's segmentation and zero trust, it's identity and access management. It's some really kind of simple things that we can do that really reduces exposure, recognizing that while we have been talking about ransomware for several years now, one day we're going to wake up and we're not going to be talking about ransomware, just like we don't talk about credential theft and Zeus anymore back in the keystroke logger days, right? So it's going to become something else. And so what it comes back to is, are we protecting data and our clients' data, recognizing now that IP addresses and MAC addresses are considered personally identifiable information in many states now as of 2023, if you use cookies for marketing. So how many people even know that? And these are the things that are much bigger, to Matt's point, than just a ransom event and what those costs might be, and whether insurance companies are going to be willing to continue to shoulder the burden of regulatory fines and other elements of coverages beyond just paying ransoms or forensic analysis to handle those kinds of losses.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with both of you. And I think the evidence of that is, or the proof in the pudding rather, is the fact that there were fewer ransomware payments last year than there ever has been since it became a trend. And so already we're starting to see that shift in the market and shift in threat actor activity, because there's going to be a new, breach of the day, threat of the day. And whether that's folks maliciously weaponizing ChatGPT for extremely accurate and very convincing business email compromise campaigns that are ultimately targeting, financial fraud or other types of losses, or whatever, the next kind of major threat ends up being. I think it really further highlights the need to have a strategy that addresses everything and not just one particular risk. And Ryan, I'm curious about your thoughts on that point in particular, given your background and kind of how close you've been to the delivery of a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I'll echo everything everyone said, and I think people just don't really think through the true cost of when something goes wrong. I mean, we specialize in recovery, so we're the ones rebuilding workstations and servers, and I know the carrier rates and the hours we would get, right? So we'd get 2 hours per endpoint compromised, anywhere from $185 to $250 an hour. We'd get 4 to 8 hours per server at $375 to $450 an hour. So do the math in your own environment. I'm not talking about ransom payment or forensics or the disclosures or counsel or the breach coaches. I've just lived in the recovery world. So I think to everyone's point, to think that your carrier is going to step in and pay for all of these things just because you have a simple policy is non-realistic, which is what's ultimately leading to stricter underwriting requirements and essentially carriers becoming regulators in a way, which I think is fantastic. Because at the end of the day, the reason they're doing it is to prevent massive disruption in your organization, right? So the nice thing about cyber insurance shifting to I just say follow the money. The people who are at risk of losing the most money are telling you to do something differently because they do not want to lose money. Therefore, you don't want to lose money. So make the changes, right? So I think this is, I'm hoping at some point this just becomes, foundational to operating a business like anything else. I always go to simple analogies. We experienced a house fire over the last year. I learned a lot about fire insurance, and I learned a lot about things that you need and you don't have. And ultimately, there are requirements and building codes from your city that say, here's how you have to put a house together, but you can still have a fire, right? I think to Matt's point on the reputational stuff, I do think there's more tolerance right now in our society for people who experience a cyber attack probably than there's ever been because it's just so public and often. However, I do not think there's any tolerance for people who have not taken strategic steps to try to prevent that in the first place. And that, to me, is where companies really get caught right now. We experienced a cyber breach. My first question is, what were you proactively trying to do to prevent it? If the answer is nothing, I am very upset as a customer of yours, right? If it is, we were adhering to these control frameworks, we put these things in place, and you know what, they still got us. Okay, we can work with that, right? So I think we're kind of in this interesting time where it's somewhat expected and accepted. However, I do think there's a very high expectation that you, as someone who holds sensitive data, provides a very valuable service, is doing whatever you can to protect me as your customer. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think that really that's a part of incident response planning that a lot of organizations, even that have mature security programs, often neglect because they're not thinking about that communication and the outside response piece. If you're in the manufacturing world, depending on what part of it you're in, there a lot of suppliers in that world will rate you, and you have kind of an ongoing history of any activity like this and any kind of disruptions that stopped production. If you have line outages that go, for certain lengths of time, they start having to pay by the minute or the hour in some cases, according to those contracts. And that's just one industry. Every industry has its own kind of ways of holding partners and third parties that they work with accountable. And I think a lot of people don't think about those considerations, both from an incident response planning perspective, but also just in terms of how they manage their cyber risk in general. Great responses. I completely agree with all of that. Thank you.